The first thing Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes did after the woman turned around and walked back down the sidewalk toward the visitor lot was permit himself a small, private smile. It was the kind of smile a man wore when a small nuisance had resolved itself without paperwork. It was 7:04 on a Tuesday morning at the pedestrian checkpoint of Gate 2, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the air still held the coolness of a September dawn that had not yet decided whether it wanted to become warm. The woman he had just dismissed was already 50 feet down the sidewalk, walking at an unhurried pace, her back straight, a slim leather portfolio held loosely at her side. She had not argued. She had not raised her voice. She had not asked for a supervisor. She had simply listened, nodded once, and turned and gone the way he had told her to go. Hayes watched her all the way to the corner where the sidewalk bent left toward the visitor parking lot, and then he lost sight of her behind the low wall of the guard shack. He turned back to face the empty lane in front of him. Private First Class Kevin Alderman, who was working the vehicle side of the checkpoint 15 feet away, glanced over from the driver's window of a green sedan he was checking through. He had caught most of the exchange. He had not caught all of it. What he had caught had put a small, uncertain crease in his forehead that had not been there 5 minutes earlier. "Everything good, Sergeant?" Alderman asked, in the tone a young soldier used when he was not sure whether he was allowed to be asking. Hayes did not turn to look at him. "Everything's fine, Alderman. Some civilian got herself lost on the way somewhere. Handled." He rapped his knuckles once on the metal frame of the guard shack and reached for the clipboard that held the morning access roster. The name the woman had given him twice in the last 4 minutes was not on that roster. He had checked it once, quickly, in the way a man checks a thing he already knows the answer to. It had not been there. That, as far as Sergeant Darnell Hayes was concerned, was the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. The woman walking away from Gate 2 at 3 minutes past 7 that morning was named Marcia Langston. She was 53 years old. She had been born in Beaufort, South Carolina. She held a bachelor's degree from South Carolina State, a master's from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a second master's from the National War College. She had commanded a maneuver battalion in Iraq at the rank of lieutenant colonel, a heavy brigade combat team in Afghanistan at the rank of colonel, and had spent the last 3 years as the deputy commanding general of United States Army Forces Command. 11 days earlier, the United States Senate had confirmed her by a vote of 87-9 as the incoming 4-star commander of the very installation whose gate she had just been ordered to leave. She was walking away because she had told herself the night before that she was going to do exactly this. She was going to arrive at Fort Bragg alone, in civilian clothes, on the morning before her change of command ceremony, without a driver, without an aide, and without a single star visible anywhere on her person. She was going to see with her own eyes how the gates of her new installation treated a middle-aged black woman who did not appear, at first glance, to be anyone in particular. She had spent the drive down from Washington the previous evening thinking about the reports that had been piling up on her desk over the preceding 6 months. Not the loud reports, the quiet ones, the complaints that got closed with a single paragraph of response, the names that kept surfacing across different files across different years without anyone at the installation level ever quite connecting them. Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes's name had appeared in 5 of them. Marcia reached the curb of the visitor lot at 7:06. She did not look back. She unlocked the rental sedan with the small key fob in her jacket pocket, opened the driver's door, slid inside, and closed it behind her with the same measured motion she used for most things. She placed the leather portfolio on the passenger seat. She rested both hands on the steering wheel for a moment. She did not start the engine. Through the windshield she could see the guard shack of Gate 2 about 120 yards away, angled slightly to her right. She could see the silhouette of Sergeant Hayes moving around inside it. She could see the vehicle lane where a small line of cars had begun to form as the 7 o'clock arrival wave built up. She watched for perhaps 90 seconds without moving. She was not deciding what to do next. She had decided what to do next the night before, in a hotel room in Fayetteville, sitting at a small desk with a legal pad and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her elbow. She was simply, in that 90 seconds, filing what had just happened. She was filing the way Hayes had looked at her before she had finished her first sentence. She was filing the fact that he had never once during the 4-minute exchange picked up the phone on the shelf behind him to verify anything she had said. She was filing the fact that a young private first class working the vehicle lane 15 feet away had watched the entire encounter through the driver's window of a green sedan and had not spoken. She was filing the fact that on the roster clipboard hanging inside the guard shack, her name was in fact printed on the second page, under the section reserved for advance notice VIP arrivals, because her chief of staff had transmitted the courtesy notification to the installation the previous afternoon, exactly as protocol required, and someone at Fort Bragg had received it, and someone had printed it, and someone had put it in the binder Hayes had glanced at without turning the page. She was filing all of it. She would remember all of it. That was, in the end, the thing that certain sorts of men had spent 31 years underestimating about her. She remembered everything. She turned the key in the ignition. She backed the sedan out of the visitor space. She drove out of the lot, took a right at the light, and drove 3 miles east to a small chain hotel just off the highway where her aide-de-camp was waiting in the lobby with a garment bag over one arm and a coffee in the other, and where at 11:45 that night she would review the personnel files of every soldier assigned to gate duty on the installation, one by one, with a black felt pen in her hand and a pot of tea on the side table beside her. To understand why a black woman who had been confirmed by the United States Senate for the 4-star command of one of the largest and most operationally significant Army installations in the country had chosen to spend her first morning on that installation walking up to a pedestrian gate in a plain gray blazer with no identification visible on her person, you have to understand who Marcia Langston actually was. You have to understand the woman herself, not the placeholder that Sergeant Hayes had constructed in his head between the moment she stepped out of the rideshare and the moment he told her to leave. She had been born in the coastal lowcountry of South Carolina, in a house her grandfather had built on a 2-acre lot at the edge of a marsh road. Her father had been a shipyard welder at the Naval Yard in Charleston. Her mother had taught 5th grade at a segregated elementary school for the first 9 years of her career, and at an integrated one for the next 30. Marcia had been the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter. She had been by the time she was 10 the child who read her father's copies of American Rifleman for fun. Her father had been a quiet man who did not talk much about the world outside the shipyard, but who had 2 rules for his 4 children that he had repeated so often the words had passed into the private grammar of the family. The first rule was that you did your work before you asked anyone to notice you. The second rule was that when a person underestimated you, you did not correct them out loud. You corrected them by continuing to do your work until the correction happened on its own. Marcia had absorbed both rules by osmosis, in the way children absorb the operating principles of the households they grow up inside. She had lived by them for the next 43 years without ever quite realizing they were the load-bearing beams of her entire adult character. She had graduated from her high school in Beaufort at the top of her class. She had turned down a full scholarship to a small liberal arts college in Virginia in order to accept a partial scholarship and an ROTC commission at South Carolina State, because her older brother had explained to her over a Sunday dinner the summer she was 17 that the Army was the one American institution he had ever encountered that would tell a black woman precisely, in writing, what the requirements were, and would then have the decency to promote her when she met them. He had said this with the tired certainty of a man who had spent 6 years as a supply sergeant and knew what he was talking about. Marcia had listened. She had taken the ROTC scholarship. She had reported to her first duty station as a second lieutenant of the Transportation Corps at the age of 22. On her third day in uniform, at a battalion in processing office in Fort Eustis, she had been mistaken by a passing major for the coffee runner and had been asked to bring him a cup with 2 sugars. She had walked to the break room. She had made the coffee. She had brought it back. She had set it on his desk without comment. She had gone back to her own desk and had gotten on with her paperwork, and she had waited for the correction to happen on its own. The correction had happened the following Monday morning at a staff meeting where the major had walked into the conference room and had seen her sitting in the second lieutenant's chair at the table and had, in front of the entire battalion staff, gone the color of unripe strawberries. He had not apologized. He had simply, from that day forward, never once looked her directly in the eye again for the 18 months they had served in the same command. Marcia had understood, sitting at that table with her coffee in front of her and her notebook open, that this was going to happen to her over and over for the rest of her career. She had also understood that the only sustainable answer was the one her father had given her 12 years earlier in a workshop behind the house. You do your work. You do it so well that the room eventually has no choice but to rearrange itself around you. You do not spend your energy correcting the people who cannot see you yet. You save your energy for the people who can. She had commanded a truck company in Kuwait during the invasion of Iraq. She had commanded a movement control battalion in Baghdad during the surge. She had run a brigade support element out of Bagram airfield in Afghanistan. She had done a year on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon and had come off it with a personal note in her file, hand-signed by the vice chairman, describing her as the most operationally lucid logistics officer he had encountered in 28 years of service. She had made her first star at 45. She had made her second at 48. She had made her third at 51. 2 weeks before this Tuesday morning at Gate 2 of Fort Bragg, she had made her fourth. Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes did not know any of that. He had looked at a middle-aged woman in a gray blazer and had decided who she was inside of 3 seconds. He was about to spend the next 36 hours discovering how thoroughly wrong those 3 seconds had been. He was going to discover it in stages, in a sequence carefully engineered by a woman who had already decided the shape of the lesson before she had backed her rental sedan out of the visitor lot. He was going to discover it in front of every soldier assigned to Gate 2, every officer in the change of command party, and eventually every non-commissioned officer at Fort Bragg who read the base weekly bulletin. He did not know any of that yet. At 7-Eleven that morning, he was signing off a delivery truck at the vehicle lane and thinking about what he was going to order for lunch. To understand the machinery that Marcia Langston had already set in motion by the time she reached her hotel, you have to back up about 6 months. You have to sit at her desk at Forces Command Headquarters at Fort Liberty, as it had briefly been called during the redesignation years, and then reverted, in the small ceremonial way the Army handles these things, back to Bragg. You have to look at the stack of manila folders she had begun accumulating on the left side of her desk in March. You have to understand what those folders were. They were the closeout memos. Every complaint filed against a soldier or civilian on any installation within her command that had been closed without adverse action over the preceding 36 months. She had asked for them in a memorandum to her Inspector General in late February. She had asked for them because she had noticed a pattern in the summary reports she was receiving. Complaints from soldiers of color at certain installations were being closed at a rate that did not match the rate at other installations. Complaints from black women in particular were being closed with response language so bland and so consistently identical from file to file that a reasonable person reading them in sequence would have concluded, correctly, that the language had been generated by a template. She had requested the underlying files. Her Inspector General had delivered them. She had spent her evenings over the following 4 months reading them. She had read them the way she read most things, slowly, with a felt-tip pen in her hand, making small marks in the margins that meant nothing to anyone except her. She had noticed, as she read, that the same names kept surfacing across different complaints across different years. She had begun a separate list. She had written it on a legal pad, one name per line, with a small tally mark after each name for every complaint in which that name appeared as the subject NCO or the responding official. By the time she had finished reading all of the files, the legal pad had 41 names on it. 6 of those names had 4 or more tally marks after them. Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes had 5. She had known, sitting at her desk at Forces Command on a Thursday evening in late June with a pot of tea beside her elbow and the legal pad open in front of her, that she was going to be nominated in a matter of weeks to take command of Fort Bragg. The confirmation vote was already effectively locked in. She had known that Sergeant Hayes was one of the non-commissioned officers she was going to inherit. She had known that a formal top-down review from her Inspector General's office was going to take 12 to 18 months to produce anything actionable, and would in all likelihood be diffused, softened, or absorbed into the ordinary administrative machinery of the installation before it ever reached a soldier like Hayes. She had decided that night that, when she arrived at Fort Bragg, she was not going to arrive the way generals arrived. She was going to arrive the way she had arrived at every duty station of her career, quietly, without announcement, with her stars in a garment bag and her rank in her pocket and her portfolio in her hand, and she was going to see for herself. The lobby of the hotel off Bragg Boulevard was nearly empty when Marcia walked back through the sliding doors at 7:23. A retired couple was drinking coffee at one of the small round tables near the breakfast bar. A hotel clerk was refilling a tray of pastries under a plastic dome. In one of the padded chairs against the far wall, a woman in a dark green service uniform stood up as soon as Marcia crossed the threshold, tucked a folded newspaper under one arm, and picked up the garment bag that had been resting on the chair beside her. Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Beckwith was 44 years old, 5'6", and had served as Marcia's aide-de-camp for the previous 2 years and 8 months. She had not slept well the night before. She had known where Marcia was going that morning, and she had known why, and she had known better than to ask whether it was necessary. She had watched Marcia walk out of the hotel at 6:45 in a plain gray blazer with her portfolio under one arm, and she had spent the intervening 38 minutes sitting in the lobby drinking a cup of coffee she had not tasted a single sip of, waiting. She crossed the lobby without hurrying. She stopped at the correct distance. She did not salute. Neither of them was in uniform, and they were in a hotel lobby with a retired couple 10 feet away. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "how did it go?" "Exactly the way I expected it to go," Marcia said. "Let's go upstairs. I need to change, and I need to make 2 phone calls before 9 o'clock. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. Andrea unlocked the door to the small suite that had been reserved for the general under a name that was not her own, held the door open, and followed Marcia inside. She hung the garment bag on the closet rod. She set the newspaper on the small desk near the window. She waited. Marcia set the leather portfolio on the desk, opened it, and removed a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of the morning access roster for Gate 2, the same roster Sergeant Hayes had glanced at without turning the page. Her chief of staff had emailed it to Andrea at 5:40 that morning as a matter of routine documentation. Andrea had printed it and had placed it in the portfolio before Marcia had left the hotel. On the second page, in the section reserved for advance notice VIP arrivals, the name Langston, M, was printed in 12-point type on the 3rd line from the top, next to a time window that read 6:30 to 800. Marcia took a black felt-tip pen from her jacket pocket. She circled her name once. She set the sheet of paper on the desk with the circle facing up. "Andrea," she said, "ma'am, I need you to call Colonel Rasmussen at the installation, and I need you to be very careful with your language. I do not want him to know I am on the ground. I do not want him to know I have already been to a gate. I want you to tell him that the General's advance party will be arriving at Gate 2 at 0900 hours for a walkthrough of the ceremonial site, and that the General herself will be joining that walkthrough at 0930. I want you to ask him to have the senior non-commissioned officer of Gate 2 present at that walkthrough, in duty uniform, at the pedestrian checkpoint. I want you to be very clear that this is a courtesy request from the incoming commander's staff for a routine familiarization, and that no formal notification is required." Andrea did not write any of it down. She did not need to. "Yes, ma'am. After you make that call, I need you to call Command Sergeant Major Whitfield directly, not through his office, on his personal line. Tell him I would like to meet with him privately in his office at 0845. Tell him to bring the personnel file of Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes." Andrea was already halfway to the desk phone by the time Marcia finished the sentence. She had worked for the general long enough to recognize the shape of the machinery being assembled. The two calls Marcia had just described were, on their face, routine morning administrative touches. In sequence, delivered inside the same 20-minute window, they were the first two moves of a chessboard that was going to be fully arranged by 9 o'clock. The first call went exactly the way Marcia had scripted it. Colonel Ronald Rasmussen was the acting garrison commander and would be running the change of command ceremony the following morning. He was 51 years old, 29 years in, and had been on the phone to his wife when Andrea's call came in. He answered the second line with the crisp, slightly over-prepared cheerfulness of an officer who knew the incoming four-star staff was in town, and who had decided the night before that every interaction with that staff was going to be handled personally. Andrea delivered the request exactly as instructed. Rasmussen wrote it down. He confirmed the timing. He said the words, "Not a problem," 3 separate times in the course of 45 seconds. He hung up and immediately called down to the Garrison Operations Center and directed the shift supervisor to have Gate 2's senior NCO present at the pedestrian checkpoint in duty uniform at 0900 hours for a familiarization walkthrough with the incoming commander's advance party. The shift supervisor made a note. He called Gate 2. He spoke to Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes, who was standing at the vehicle lane finishing a bottle of water. The shift supervisor told him to be at the pedestrian checkpoint at 0900 in duty uniform for a walkthrough with the incoming commander's advance party. He said the words "duty uniform" twice because the shift supervisor knew Hayes and knew that Hayes had a habit of interpreting instructions liberally when the instructions did not come from a person he particularly respected. Hayes said, "Copy that, Sergeant." He hung up the receiver. He looked at the clock inside the guard shack. It read 7:41. He had, by his own calculation, 1 hour and 19 minutes to prepare. He did not think about the woman in the gray blazer. He had not thought about her since 7:07. She had, as far as he was concerned, walked out of his morning and out of his life. The second call, the one Andrea placed at 7:32 to Command Sergeant Major Elias Whitfield's personal cell phone, went differently. Whitfield was 61 years old. He had been the command sergeant major of Fort Bragg for the past 3 years and had been in the Army for 38 of them. He had heard Marcia Langston's name for the first time in 1998, when she had been a captain running a truck company in Kuwait, and he had been a staff sergeant on the same forward operating base. And he had watched her, over the intervening 28 years, at a respectful professional distance, from the vantage point of a non-commissioned officer who understood exactly what he was watching. He had been briefed 6 weeks earlier that she was coming to Fort Bragg. He had, since that briefing, spent a considerable portion of his personal evenings quietly reviewing the personnel files of every senior NCO on the installation and cross-referencing them with the closed complaint files at the Inspector General's office. He had done this on his own initiative, without being asked, because he had spent 38 years learning what kind of commander was about to arrive at Fort Bragg, and he had wanted to be able to answer any question she asked him on her first day without having to say the words, "Let me check on that." When Andrea's call came in and she asked him to meet with the general privately at 0845 and to bring the personnel file of Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes, Whitfield closed his eyes for a brief second. He did not sigh. He did not react at all. He simply said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there. I'll have 3 files." "3," Andrea said. "Yes, 3," Whitfield said. At 0843, A black sedan pulled up in front of the low brick building that housed the office of the command sergeant major of Fort Bragg. The driver was a warrant officer in duty uniform. The passenger in the back seat, seated on the right, was a woman in the service dress uniform of a four-star general of the United States Army. The 4 silver stars on each shoulder were arranged in the precise diamond pattern the regulations specified. A row of ribbons and unit awards ran across the left breast of her jacket in the careful order that 31 years of service had earned. She stepped out of the sedan without waiting for the driver to open the door. She was carrying the same leather portfolio she had carried at 7 that morning. She was, in every other visible respect, an entirely different person. Andrea followed her out of the sedan, 1 pace behind and to the left. They walked up the short concrete path to the front door of the building. The staff duty specialist inside the entryway saw the stars through the glass and came to his feet so quickly he knocked over the paper cup of coffee he had just set down on the desk. He recovered. He held the door. He said, "Good morning, General." Marcia nodded once and passed through without breaking stride. Command Sergeant Major Whitfield was standing in the doorway of his office at the end of the interior hallway. He was in his Class A uniform. He had polished the toes of his low quarters that morning himself in his kitchen at 5:15 while his wife made coffee. He came to attention as Marcia approached. She stopped at the correct distance. She returned his salute. She extended her hand. "Sergeant Major, General Langston." "Ma'am, welcome to Fort Bragg." "Thank you, Sergeant Major. Let's talk." He stood aside. She walked into his office. Andrea did not follow her in. She closed the door behind the general and took the chair in the outer waiting area next to the staff duty specialist, who had not yet sat back down and was staring at the door with the expression of a young soldier who had understood in the space of about 11 seconds that his morning was going to be memorable. Inside the office, 3 manila folders were arranged in a neat vertical stack in the center of the sergeant major's desk. Marcia did not sit down at first. She stood in front of the desk. She looked at the stack of folders for a moment. Then she looked at Whitfield. "Sergeant Major, before we begin, I want to say 2 things to you, ma'am. The first is that I have been aware of your work at this installation for a considerable period of time, and I selected Fort Bragg as my next command in part because you are the senior non-commissioned officer here. That is not flattery. It is a matter of record. I want you to know that." Whitfield's throat moved once. He did not speak. "The second is that I walked up to Gate 2 of this installation at 7 o'clock this morning in civilian clothes. I did it without notifying you. I did it without notifying Colonel Rasmussen. I did it because I have been reading the closeout files from your Inspector General's office for the last 4 months, and I wanted to see, with my own eyes, one piece of what is in those files. I saw it." Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes turned me away from the pedestrian checkpoint at 7:02 without checking his roster, without checking my identification, and without notifying anyone above him. The private first class working the vehicle lane 15 feet away observed the entire exchange and did not intervene. I want you to hear from me directly, before we open any of these files, that I did not do that in order to lay a trap for a single sergeant. I did it to take a temperature reading of an installation. Do you understand the distinction I am making? "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Good. Sit down. Open the first file." Whitfield sat. He turned the first folder around and slid it across the desk in one motion. Marcia lowered herself into the chair on the visitor's side, set the leather portfolio flat on her lap, and opened the folder. The file was thick. It was arranged in the standard order the personnel office at Bragg used for enlisted records. Enlistment paperwork on the far left. Performance evaluations behind that. Awards, schools, deployments, discipline. The discipline section was, in Sergeant Hayes's case, thin. 2 counseling statements over 14 years, both administrative, both closed without action. On paper, in the language of the personnel system, Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes was a solid mid-career NCO with a clean record. Underneath the personnel file, held in place with a single black binder clip, was a second document. It was not part of the official file. It was 31 pages long. It was a chronology, compiled by Command Sergeant Major Whitfield himself over the preceding 6 weeks, cross-referencing every complaint filed against Hayes at the installation level, every remark made about him in the after-action reviews of gate incidents, every anonymous entry in the Equal Opportunity Hotline log that matched his post, and every soldier or civilian who had, in any recorded context, described being turned away, delayed, or questioned at Gate 2 under circumstances that did not conform to the installation's own written access policy. The chronology did not editorialize. It did not draw conclusions. It simply arranged the facts in date order, one entry per line, with the source document cited in the right margin. Marcia read it without speaking for 4.5 minutes. She turned the pages slowly. At page 17 she paused, took the felt-tip pen from her jacket pocket and made a small mark in the margin. At page 23 she paused again and made a second mark. She reached the end of the chronology. She closed the folder. She looked at Whitfield. "How long did this take you to compile, Sergeant Major?" "6 weeks, ma'am, evenings mostly." "On whose authority?" "My own, ma'am." She held his eyes for a long moment. "Understood. Open the second file." The second file was Private First Class Kevin Alderman's. Whitfield had included it because Alderman had been on shift at Gate 2 for 11 of the 14 incidents documented in the chronology. Alderman was 20 years old, 6 months out of AIT, and had been assigned to Gate 2 as his first duty station. His personnel file was almost empty. There was nothing in it, in any conventional sense, to review. What Whitfield had included behind the personnel file was a single-page memorandum, unsigned, in the sergeant major's own handwriting, describing a conversation Whitfield had initiated with Alderman 2 weeks earlier under the pretext of a routine welfare check, in which Alderman had, without being pressed, described in 3 specific instances feeling that his sergeant had turned away visitors he probably shouldn't have, and had stated that he had not known who to raise the concern with. Marcia read the memorandum twice. She set it down. The third file was the thinnest of the 3. It contained the personnel record of a specialist Camille Bourne, a black female soldier assigned to the finance detachment on the installation, who had, 7 months earlier, filed a formal complaint against Sergeant First Class Hayes after being questioned at Gate 2 on 3 separate occasions over a 9-week period despite arriving each time in duty uniform, in a vehicle bearing the installation's own decal. Her complaint had been closed at the installation level with a 1-paragraph response. The response used language that Marcia recognized, word for word, from 4 other closeout memos she had read at her desk in June. She read Specialist Bourne's complaint in full. She read the closeout memo. She closed the folder. "Sergeant Major." "Ma'am." "Where is Specialist Bourne today?" "On the installation, ma'am. She works the 2nd shift at finance. She is scheduled to be in the audience at the change of command tomorrow morning as part of the finance detachment's formation." "Good. I want her seated in the front row of the enlisted section. Make it happen quietly." "Yes, ma'am." Marcia closed the 3rd folder and set it on top of the other 2. She rested her hands on the stack for a brief moment, in a gesture that had nothing performative about it and was simply the physical acknowledgement of a weight she had now formally accepted. She looked up at Whitfield. "Here is what is going to happen this morning, Sergeant Major. At 0900 hours, Colonel Rasmussen will meet a familiarization party at the pedestrian checkpoint of Gate 2. That party will consist of Lieutenant Colonel Beckwith, a warrant officer from my staff, and a photographer from the Installation Public Affairs Office, who will believe he has been assigned to take routine site survey pictures for the change of command briefing book. Sergeant First Class Hayes has been directed to be present at the checkpoint in duty uniform. He will not know I am part of the party. I will arrive on foot from the visitor lot in service dress at 0930, exactly as I did this morning, except this time I will not be wearing a gray blazer." Whitfield did not smile. His face did the thing his face did when a professional satisfaction that he was not permitted to display arranged itself somewhere behind his eyes and stayed there. "Yes, ma'am." I do not want him relieved on the spot. I do not want a scene at the gate. I want him to see me. I want him to understand what he saw at 7 o'clock this morning, and I want him to complete his shift. At the conclusion of his shift, he will report to your office. You will inform him that he is being placed on administrative reassignment pending an investigation, that his access to the pedestrian checkpoint at any gate on this installation is suspended effective immediately, and that a formal Article 15 process will be initiated within 72 hours. You will conduct that conversation yourself. You will not delegate it. Yes, ma'am. Tomorrow morning, at the change of command, Sergeant Hayes will be present in the formation of non-commissioned officers on the parade ground as previously scheduled. I do not want that changed. He needs to see the ceremony. He needs to see it from where he was going to see it before any of this happened. That is important to me. Understood, ma'am. Private First Class Alderman is a separate matter. He is 20 years old. He is 6 months out of AIT. He did not intervene this morning because no one has ever taught him how, and because the person he would have had to intervene against was his immediate supervisor on his first duty assignment. I am not going to punish him for that. I am going to give him a second chance, and I am going to give it to him in a form he understands. I want him reassigned within 30 days to a gate detail under an NCO of your personal selection, and I want a formal mentorship note placed in his file over your signature indicating that he is to be evaluated for promotion consideration in the next cycle. Are we clear? Clear, ma'am. Specialist born. I am going to speak to her personally tomorrow after the ceremony in this office. I want her present at 1400 hours. I want you present as well. I am not going to reopen her complaint through the installation channels. I am going to have my Inspector General open a command-level review of every closeout memo issued at Fort Bragg over the last 36 months that used the boilerplate language I identified in June. That review will be conducted by a team from outside this installation. It will be complete within 90 days. Its findings will be published in summary form on the installation intranet. Whitfield's jaw moved once. He looked for a moment at the edge of his own desk. Ma'am, may I say something? You may. I have been in this uniform for 38 years. I have served under 16 general officers. I want you to know that I am glad you are here. Marcia held his gaze for a long moment. Thank you, Sergeant Major. So am I. At 9:28 the following morning, Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes was standing at parade rest just inside the pedestrian checkpoint of Gate 2, in duty uniform, his boots polished, his beret squared, watching a small familiarization party gathered on the sidewalk about 15 feet away. Colonel Rasmussen was in the center of the group with a clipboard. Lieutenant Colonel Beckwith was on his left. A warrant officer he did not recognize was on his right. A photographer from Public Affairs was taking pictures of the vehicle lane. Hayes did not know why they needed pictures of the vehicle lane. He also did not particularly care. He had been standing at parade rest for 29 minutes. The morning was warming. He was thinking about coffee. At 9:29 and 40 seconds, a figure appeared on the sidewalk at the far end of the visitor lot, walking toward the gate at an unhurried pace. Hayes registered the figure the way he registered every approaching pedestrian, in the peripheral, dismissive way of a man whose job it was to filter human beings into categories. His brain assigned this one to a category and moved on. Then, about 8 seconds later, his brain, running slightly behind his eyes, revised the assignment. The woman was in a service dress uniform. The jacket was dark green. There were 4 silver stars on each shoulder. She was carrying the same slim leather portfolio she had carried at 7 o'clock the previous morning. Sergeant First Class Bradley, the muscle at Hayes's temple, which had moved so confidently the previous morning, was now not moving at all. Nothing in his face was moving. The color that had been in his cheeks a moment earlier began to travel downward in a slow, deliberate migration that reached the line of his collar and kept going. His mouth opened slightly. He did not know it had opened. His hands at the small of his back in the parade rest position tightened around one another and held. Marcia reached the pedestrian checkpoint. Colonel Rasmussen, who had turned at the sound of her footsteps, came to attention and saluted. Lieutenant Colonel Beckwith did the same. The warrant officer did the same. The photographer, who had not been briefed on any of this, lowered his camera and stared. Marcia returned the salutes. She stepped past Rasmussen. She stopped in front of Sergeant First Class Hayes at a distance of about 4 feet. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Sergeant Hayes," he tried to answer. The word did not form. He tried again. "Ma'am, do you recognize me, Sergeant?" A very long second passed. The photographer, without lifting the camera, took one step backward. Colonel Rasmussen, who had been looking at Marcia, turned his head very slowly and looked at Hayes, and the expression on his face changed as, in the space of approximately 3 heartbeats, he understood what he was watching. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Complete your shift, Sergeant. Report to the command sergeant major at its conclusion. Carry on." She did not wait for a response. She turned. She walked back through the pedestrian checkpoint onto the installation, and the familiarization party fell in behind her, and Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes remained at parade rest at the gate for the next 4 hours, and did not, in the entire duration of those 4 hours, speak a single unnecessary word to anyone. The change of command ceremony took place the following morning on the parade ground at 1100 hours precisely. Marcia accepted the flag of Fort Bragg with both hands. She spoke for 12 minutes. Specialist Camille Bourne sat in the front row of the enlisted section. Private First Class Kevin Alderman stood in the third rank of the enlisted formation. Sergeant First Class Darnell Hayes stood in the second rank and watched and understood. So here is the question I want to leave you with. Not about Marcia, not about Hayes, about the sidewalk. If you had been the private at the vehicle lane at 7:02 that morning, would you have said something? Tell me in the comments. Like, subscribe, peace, and see ya.